Hi, a very warm good evening to friends and comrades. So, without much delay, I think we can go to the session. Everybody was waiting in this. So, while we know the effect of COVID-19 pandemic on the economy was nothing more like a catastrophe, and the response of central government to such a situation was more or less the same. So, today we have gathered here through this means to discuss about this recently announced Atmanirbhar package by the central government. So we today have the renowned economist Professor Jayati Ghosh. Welcome, ma'am. And I don't think we need much of an introduction for you. Still, for the sake of saying it, ma'am, professor is currently working in JNU in the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, and works on international economics, especially issues in like oriented in gender, development, labor was remarkable. So we can't think of a more suitable name to take this session. So without much delay, I would like to hand over the section to you, ma'am. It's only that.
Thank you very much, Asika. It's a pleasure to meet you all, at least virtually, if not face to face. But let me not waste too much time. Let's start immediately talking about the issue. And what I'd like to do is to place this recent package of Nirmala Sitharaman, which she spent 5 days announcing, in a broader context of the government's response overall. And I think there are 7 features of this Indian response which are quite unusual, which are in fact unlike most other countries. And there are some similarities, but broadly, the Indian response has been quite different, and I want to highlight that. So what are the 7 features? The first is centralization. This has been a remarkable exercise in the central government gathering to itself even more powers, both administrative and financial, and refusing to actually do the kinds of cooperation and coordination that are very, very necessary to deal with a pandemic like this. So what do I mean? Well, first of all, the Disaster Management Act was invoked at the start of the lockdown to, in fact, impose the lockdown. And this is an act that gives immense powers to the central government and the National Disaster Management Authority, which is also controlled by the central government, to the point where all other institutions of the state governments, public sector enterprises, municipalities, local governments, everybody has to actually obey whatever decisions and whatever diktats are made by the National Disaster Management Authority and by the central government. And this has actually been quite a complicated thing, because while it has centralized powers, it has also given all of the responsibility of dealing with the pandemic to the states. It's quite remarkable that both in terms of financial input, which I will come to, but the fiscal spending that is involved, and the actual administrative dealing with the matters, the center has really left it to the states. It is really forcing the states, if you like, to be Atmanirbhar in that sense, just like it's forcing the citizenry to be Atmanirbhar. So centralization is a very, very key element of this. And this centralization has also led to a number of coordination failures in terms of how the lockdown was imposed, the kinds of rules that you would require in it, the public health matters, all of these. Okay, so excessive centralization at a time when, in fact, the work is being done by the state governments, but the decisions are all made by the center. I think that's one important feature. The first lockdown, as you all know, was for us notice, and even the state governments didn't know, even other ministries didn't know. The finance minister seemed to suggest that she didn't know either. And of course, then it's been extended continuously, but once again, without really getting the proper inputs from the states. So that various things are opened up without the state's permission, like train travel. West Bengal said, we're not ready. The center said, too bad, you have to accept it. The trains are coming. Air travel has now been opened up. The government of Maharashtra has said, we can't accept them, to the point where they are saying, well, you can bring the planes to Mumbai airport, but we cannot let people out of the airport because we are not prepared. We don't have the facilities for actually checking, testing all of them and so on. The second important feature is that We had, of course, the most draconian lockdown in the world. Everybody knows that. It's the most stringent. It got 100 out of 100 points in the Oxford University's Blavatsky School Index of Stringency. So we have the most stringent lockdown in the world. But the purpose of the lockdown was not that, just closing down is going to get rid of the virus. That everybody should have known. And the WHO kept warning the Indian government that. The purpose was to actually prepare the public health system, to make sure you had enough testing kits, to make sure you had enough protective equipment for all of the health workers, to ensure enough hospital beds, ventilators, whatever else is required for this public health pandemic. And by now, everyone knew what was required. Certainly, the Chinese experience had given all countries an indication of what is required. Unfortunately, there was inadequate preparation. So, first of all, state governments were left to fend for themselves. Then, when they were actually accessing testing kits, they were told, no, don't do it because we will get you the testing kits. ICMR will provide the testing kits. And then ICMR got some substandard testing kits from China, which turned out to give all wrong results. When the states complained, then they were told, okay, stop using those kits, send them back. And whatever then happened with the central government and ICMR and the Chinese suppliers, we don't know. But it basically meant a massive delay and shortage of these testing kits across all of the states, especially the ones that had rapidly increasing cases and were in dire need of more testing. Then the process of testing, tracing, and so on, that process is one that requires a fairly complicated kind of input. The central government solution is just make an app and impose that app on everybody. Even though it makes no sense, the app cannot give you anything unless you can actually use the information to follow up on positive cases and track their contacts through personal information by those people providing the information, and then testing those contacts. If you're not going to do that, there is no point in just having an app that is tracking people. It doesn't help in any particular way. The PPE kits, India was exporting PPE kits until early March. The Prime Minister recently announced that they have started making PPE kits for the first, protective equipment for the first time. That's wrong, because we were actually exporting these. We were exporting even masks. Now that has been stopped. But again, wasted opportunity, time lost, shortages emerging now. Similarly with ventilators, we were exporting those till late February. And orders were not placed by the central government to enable the state governments to access these as required. There was not enough coordination with the states. So while the Disaster Management Act was imposed and is being shoved down the throats of everybody, it hasn't been utilized in the way that it should by coordinating with state governments and making a pan-Indian response that recognizes the specific needs of different states. Okay, the third characteristic of the government response has been delay. And this is really very striking. Delay in response, why? You don't give the people time to prepare. You give everybody 4 hours notice to prepare for what is the most severe lockdown in the world. And you stop everything. You stop public transport, you stop all economic activity, you stop even private transport within the cities. You prevent even the desperate migrants who are walking back, you prevent them from walking. You beat them on the roads, you spray them with chemicals, you do all kinds of things like that. But you yourself are unprepared in terms of response. A government that announces a lockdown like this should also simultaneously announce the compensating measures, what it is doing for the welfare of people, why people should not get tense, why they should not panic, what they're doing to ensure their welfare during the period of the lockdown. So remember, people are not losing their incomes and livelihoods out of their own choice or out of their fear. They're losing it because the government has prevented them from doing anything. The government stops economic activity well before the pandemic had spread, at a time when we had only about 350 cases and only 4 deaths, okay? Early on, it does this complete closure, and people lose their jobs, their livelihood, sometimes their homes, right? Because a lot of it is linked to your ability to pay rent and so on. The government does nothing to compensate. It takes 4 days before the finance minister comes up with a relief package, which is pitiful in the extreme. which offers almost nothing. It offers a little bit of free food to those ration card holders who already have ration cards, okay? And that too, it offers basically 5 kilos per person for 3 months. And it offers 1 kilo of pulses, that's all. And it doesn't deal with a large number of migrants and other people who have simply been left out of the National Food Security Act, who don't have the ration cards and therefore cannot access this free food. It offers the pitiful amount of 500 rupees per month, again for 3 months, for women holders of Jan Dhan accounts. Now, this is a peculiar thing because, first of all, it doesn't capture all poor women at all. And secondly, not all holders of Jan Dhan accounts are poor. There are still about 18% are completely dormant accounts. They've never been used. And so it's very, not just random, it's foolish to put money into there. But also 500 rupees is too pitiful an amount. It's really nothing. You should have been giving 7,000 rupees per household to at least 80% of the population. And you could use various means to do this. You could use all those registered with NREGA, all of those who are registered with the National Food Security Act, all of those registered under various state schemes. The state governments could have helped you to figure out who we actually give this money to. And that would have tided over this period when they have no incomes, they have no means of support. Then, of course, there is the the delay and the parsimony. So the first was announced only on 4 days after, and then there was nothing. There was complete silence from the central government until you have recently, in the last couple of weeks, you have 2 addresses by the Prime Minister, and you have the Finance Minister coming up with this extended marathon 5-day presentations of the supposed relief package. This delay, this period of 50 days in between, when the central government offers nothing, no relief, is terrible because it means that's 50 days without any income, without more food for people who are already on the verge of starvation. People driven to desperation, which is why we have had the largest forced migration in our history after partition, of people desperately trying to get to their homes and walking endlessly. We've all heard the terrible tragedies of 12-year-old girls dying after walking 3 days continuously, dying just a little distance from their home, of women who are forced to give birth on the road and then carry their newborn infant with them as they continue walking, of men who die in accidents as they sleep on railway tracks, of people forced to travel in cement grinders. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? Terrible, terrible tragedies, only some of which have been documented, all because of delay, because of no response for 2 months, at a period when you have just prevented all of this economic activity. Accompanying this delay is parsimony. Parsimony basically being just cheap, stingy, absolutely not spending. The first package announced by the finance minister, she claimed it was about 1.7 lakh crore. It wasn't. The new money involved was only about 80,000 rupees, which is about half a percentage point of GDP. Imagine, half a percentage point of GDP. Nothing, in other words, okay? The new package that she announced, the Prime Minister declared that it's 20,000 crore. He obviously had not told the ministers about it. He certainly hadn't told the finance minister about it, because that's why she had to scuttle around and spend 5 days announcing it. Somehow she had to generate this total. She managed to generate a slightly higher total, okay? How did she generate this total? By putting in anything she could think of. Again, the new money involved in this is again only about half a percentage point of GDP. Everything else is existing schemes, front-loaded, people's own money, like their own EPF accounts, if they're allowed to access it, that is included. All kinds of, not even actual loans, but loan guarantees for a notional amount. Those are included, etc., etc., etc. So in fact, this so-called 20,000 crore package, which actually would have come to 10% of GDP if it had been all new money, actually amounts to only about 1%. It's only about 2 lakh crore at most, at the very outset, okay? The it's probably slightly less. Some estimates have put it at 0.8% of GDP. Because really, you see, it's all promises of what will be paid. First of all, it's existing spending. Then it's a lot of liquidity and credit guarantees and so on. And then a lot of it is what you could call blue sky thinking, that we're going to do these reforms, we're going to go to outer space, we're going to do this and that, okay? So actual spending, very, very little. Very, very, very parsimonious, very stingy. Now, why is that a problem? It's a huge problem because, in fact, if you do not spend now, if the government of India does not spend now, we are heading for not a recession, we are heading for an economic collapse that will be bigger than the Great Depression, okay? The estimates done by the NCAER and NIPFP suggest that this quarter, the Indian economy is contracting by anywhere between 25 to 30%, okay? By 1/3, in other words. For the year as a whole, the estimate was 12 to 15%. That is if only this first quarter is a contraction. And we don't know, because if the government does not respond, then the second quarter will also be a contraction. The third quarter may also be a contraction. In other words, it could be well above even 12%. We are talking about a terrible, disastrous decline in economic activity. Employment, we know already, the CMIE tells us that about 120 million people lost their jobs in April. We don't know how many more have lost their jobs in May. But none of these jobs may come back at all if you do not get some recovery of demand. So the critical thing that has to happen is an increase in demand, which is why the government refusing to spend money right now is not just stupid, it's criminal. It's adding to the problem. So what is the government doing? It is centralizing all of the powers in itself, and it's centralizing the finances to itself. The states have no money. The states have a hard budget constraint. They cannot spend more than what they have in their cash balances. If they do, their checks bounce. So they are desperate. Their own tax revenues have fallen. In April, most state governments got 10% of their normal tax revenue collection. 10%, okay? They can't even pay salaries with that kind of money. So they were absolutely desperate. Now they are all bringing in things like, opening liquor shops, because that's the only way they can raise some money. Even then, they're not going to be able to raise even half of what they raised in the previous year, in the current month, okay? So it's a really desperate situation for the states. The central government should have been providing much more money to them, because the central government it can borrow from the Reserve Bank of India. It can just draw on its Reserve Bank and basically print money and spend it. You have to do that now because households have no money, they cannot spend. Investors either don't have money or are unwilling to spend, because why would you invest in a climate when the market is shrinking, when you can't even sell what you have already produced, your inventories, okay? So they will not invest. It's only the government that can spend. And if the central government is the only agency, not even the state governments, because they cannot spend more than what they earn. It's only the central government that can access money from the Reserve Bank. So either they should have said that state governments can also borrow from the Reserve Bank at the repo rate, at the lowest available rate, or they should have said, we will borrow and distribute it to state governments. That didn't happen either. At least it hasn't happened so far. And so what do we have? We have an economy in decline, household spending declining, but investors also not investing, they're declining as well. And the government also spending less. So what they're calling the new spending, in addition to what they would already have spent, is actually not necessarily new spending, additional spending. It could well be that the net fiscal impetus is also negative, that the central government will also spend less this year than it spent in the previous year. Now, imagine if everybody is spending less, isn't this economy going to contract? Of course. And it will contract even worse, because then you get what is called a negative multiplier effect. You and I lose our incomes, we stop spending. The shops that we used to buy from, they stop buying from their suppliers. Those suppliers stop producing. That means they throw out more workers. That means those, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You see how it's a negative spiral. So the fact that the central government is not spending more, it's not just that it is terrible for the fact that it's not putting money in the hands of the people who need it desperately right now, but it's also terrible for the economy because it is pushing us into this downward spiral. Okay, so that's the third critical feature of the parsimony and how bad it is. This is actually unlike most other countries in the world. Most of the developed countries are putting in very, very large fiscal stimuli, from about 5% in Germany to 14% currently in the US to as much as 22% in Japan. Okay. Even countries like South Africa announced a stimulus of 10%, of which about 4% is fiscal stimulus, is actual more additional spending. And it is clearly additional spending. It is clearly putting money in the hands of ordinary people and providing welfare and providing unemployment insurance and so on. Okay. So we are unusual. We are one of the, Argentina, which is already actually in a fiscal mess, is spending 6% of GDP. Brazil is spending 10% of GDP additional, and a lot of it is putting money in the hands of people. It's welfare schemes. So we are very, very unusual in terms of this deep stinginess of the central government, which is going to have horrifying implications for how the economy plunges. And it's also, it's not just that it's stingy and parsimonious, but it's macroeconomically stupid, as I've said. It actually makes the economy fall further. And why are they doing this? Because they're trying to maintain a fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. Now, what's the problem with that? How you're trying to maintain the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio by cutting your spending. But then, because of that, GDP is falling, so the ratio will anyway go up. And also, as GDP falls, your tax revenues fall, which is what's happened to state governments, right? So your fiscal deficit will go up anyway, and the ratio to GDP will go up even more because GDP will have fallen. So you will actually end up with a worse macroeconomic indicator than if you had just borrowed from the Reserve Bank and spent more money. Okay. Please do ask me questions about this. We can come back to this. There's a whole notion that deficit financing will automatically create inflation. That is not true, because it will create inflation only if there are supply constraints, supply bottlenecks somewhere. And you could spend some of that money to make sure that there are no supply bottlenecks. Whereas if you don't spend that money, you will get supply bottlenecks. So you will get some kinds of inflation. There will be specific shortages, maybe food, maybe medicine, maybe some other essential item, and the prices of those will rise for people. Okay, the other aspect, the fifth aspect of this, well, I mentioned the fifth aspect, which is this refusal to inject demand, which is absolutely terrifying. Okay, the sixth aspect is that the focus of this package, and especially the 5-day package, the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, is all wrong. The focus is essentially on liquidity and the supply side. And the idea is that, you know, what this kind of economy needs right now is just more liquidity. People need more access to credit. And once you give them credit, they'll be all right. Now, that's not true. That's not true at all. Because, in fact, in a situation like this, even if you put money in banks, they're not going to be willing to lend because most of their borrowers, they're going to be very doubtful that they will actually make profits right now. Most borrowers will also be unwilling to borrow. Most firms will be unwilling to borrow for new investment because they can't see a market. So liquidity is never enough at a time like this. And just providing credit guarantees and so on doesn't work. Even the liquidity arrangements that have been announced, they are being implemented so badly on the ground that even the medium and small enterprises that are trying to access some of this credit, they are not being able to. Because banks are correctly feeling that the economic conditions are so bad that this borrowing is going to turn into a bad loan. And later on, I'll have to address the problem. The final seventh feature of this is that the government is using this opportunity to actually push more neoliberal reforms. And this too is going to be extremely counterproductive, but in the medium term. So the idea really is that this is the time when we can open up more sectors for foreign investment and attract foreign capital. Now, At this moment, the only foreign capital you're likely to attract, because your market is shrinking, the only foreign capital you're likely to attract is that which is trying to come and buy up Indian assets on the cheap. You sell public sector shares, the Indian rupee is depreciating, the stock market is down, people can pick up assets on the cheap. And so domestic or foreign investors will be interested in just buying up cheap assets, not necessarily investing. It's not going to help in investing at all. The labor reforms are even more misguided. 4 BJP state governments have tried to bring in labor reform. It's currently pending with the president. And a bunch of other states have also announced longer working hours. Again, this is counterproductive. The idea that having worse labor conditions, creating terrible conditions for workers will somehow generate more investment, especially attracting foreign investment that was going earlier to China, is completely misguided. Because in fact, foreign investors and domestic investors, they don't necessarily go for cheap labor. They're attracted by many things: a buoyant domestic market, good infrastructure, good amenities and facilities, and a healthy, productive workforce. Which is why China, Vietnam, Thailand, these have always attracted much more FDI than India, even though their wage rates are much, much higher. And even when FDI is leaving China, when global FDI is moving away from China, because of the trade war, because of the pandemic, and so on, they are not coming to India. They are going to Thailand, they're going to Vietnam, they're even going to the Philippines. All of these countries have got higher wages than us. All of them have got better working conditions. All of them have got more labor protection, not less. So why are these FDI companies going there? And why are Indian companies more willing to invest there? Because actually a more productive workforce comes from a better fed, better clothed, higher waged workforce. It doesn't come from forcing workers to work in the most exploitative conditions without care for their health, for their adequate nutrition, and so on, which is what you would do if you open up labor laws to the most exploitative practices possible. Okay, so these are the 7 ways in which the Indian response, I feel, has been very unusual, has not been like the response in any other country. And I do feel that it has also been a very worrying economic response. It's one that will not generate growth right now, and certainly not in the medium term. So as far as possible, we should try to create a public demand for a major change, of course. Okay, I see that there is a bunch of questions already. Let me read the first one. This pandemic has shown that women's work is easily replaceable and women are the first to lose jobs. So don't you feel gender-specific relief package is also the need of the hour? That's absolutely true. And you know what is one of the interesting things about this, all the policy responses of this government so far? They have been completely gender insensitive. Every single one of them has been so gender insensitive. When the list of essential items was announced at the first lockdown, sanitary napkins was not among them. It took 3 days of agitation and outcry before they included sanitary napkins as an essential item for production at all and distribution and so on. Subsequently, even the PPE kits, they're not designed for menstruating women, which means that all the frontline workers who should be wearing them, nurses, health workers, sanitation workers, ashas, etc., none of them is going to be able to do this comfortably when they are menstruating. Absolutely right that women are the frontline workers and they have been entirely ignored in this. They are in fact not being offered better wages and conditions. Most of them have not even been paid for several months because state governments who are supposed to pay them have no money. So in at least 7 states, ASHA workers have not been paid for 2 months. And yet they're being made to do more and more work in very, very dangerous conditions, often without even the basic protective equipment, often without even hand sanitizers, masks, and gloves. They have to supply their own. Okay. The issue of the loss of jobs, already we had the lowest women's workforce participation in the world. Already we knew from our official surveys that around 9 million job loss, most of which was women workers in the period between 2011-12 and 2017-18. So we have seen that in India, when there are fewer jobs, women get rationed out of them. They are much more likely to lose jobs. They're much more less likely to gain jobs, okay, if new jobs come up. And where then they get jobs, these are the lowest paid, the worst, the most dangerous today. The frontline health workers, it's the most dangerous job today. So we do know that anything that is trying to actually create a recovery must focus specifically on the needs of women, must focus specifically on what women require in terms of not just the nature of the job and also the kinds of protection they need. Now, one critical way of doing this is to expand public employment. If you just filled all the vacancies in central and state governments today, you would get 14 million more jobs immediately. Okay, imagine just filling the vacancies. In addition, we are under providing care services. Now that is very evident, right? We don't have enough doctors, nurses, frontline health workers of other kinds, volunteer workers, care therapists. We don't have any of the required numbers. So we need to double or triple our spending on health and on early education and all of these care activities. That inevitably will involve many more women workers, and they have to be employed with good conditions as proper government employees with proper government wages, with proper contracts, and with all of the other working conditions, instead of being called volunteer workers and being paid less than the minimum wage. Okay. The second question, is the government of the view that the recovery will be V-shaped with rapid upturn? That's why they're not spending, borrowing, henceforth having a strategy of just waiting it out. Yes, it's possible. That's why we've had the most, I mean, you could call them stupid, but they're just alarming statements from various government officials in the last few days. We've had people from the finance ministry telling us that, oh, the GDP growth will be positive this year and there's no problem really. It will be V-shaped recovery, as you say. We've had people from the Niti Aayog saying that they don't see a real economic problem in the country. So we've had, extraordinarily worrying statements. Even see the need to try and do something about it. And so that is truly terrifying, because we know that that's wrong. It's a bit like saying, if we just close down for 3 weeks, the virus will go away, which you can prove wrong in 3 weeks, with, of course, massive cost to everyone's health and to the fact that you've just kicked the can down the road without having addressed the problem at all. But similar, in this case, it's probably even worse, because as I mentioned to you already, the government is adding to the recessionary tendencies, to the contractionary tendencies. It's not just that it's not preventing them, it is making them worse. And so we're going to get an absolute nightmare in terms of the economic outcomes. Can I explain the ratio between the GDP and the fiscal deficit? Yeah, okay. This is a good question. And I knew when I was telling you that I should have been probably explaining this a bit more. So one of the ratios that has become very popular to look at, I don't think it's a great ratio myself, but everybody looks at it, is the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. You would have heard about it. Every time a budget is presented, the finance minister will announce that this is what it was this year and this is what I'm projecting it to be next year, okay? And then everybody will jump up and down about it saying, oh, it's 3.4 when she promised it would be 3.2, and actually it's not 3.4, it's 4.1, and oh my God, all hell and terrible, and why is it 4.1? It should be 3.8. You get, all of these numbers as if they're absolutely critical, and all hell will break loose if you have a higher fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. That's the presumption. Now, there are several things that you need to know about this famous magic number. First of all, it's a lie, okay? The fiscal deficit even last year was not 3.4% of GDP, okay, which was already supposed to be too much and terrible and so on. It was actually 5.8. Why? Because the government had artificially kept it down by doing lots of expenditures off budget or just delaying payments that it owed, okay? So for example, it owed the Food Corporation of India something like 60,000 rupees. It owed the MNREGA program, the state governments, it owed them something like 16,000 rupees. It owed various public sector enterprises, lots of money, a total of again 26 or 28,000 rupees, okay? And it made various other expenditures off budget. So in fact, all those people had spent money, but they were not getting paid by the central government. So it was basically a fudge, right? So if you looked at the total expenditure that had been incurred indirectly because of the central government, then you get a fiscal deficit ratio of 5.8% of GDP. Okay, so two things to be noted about this. First of all, therefore, it means that all those budget presentations and so on, they're completely opaque, they're nonsensical. But secondly, it means that 3.4 wasn't such a big deal. If everybody said 3.4 is too big and it's disastrous and it should be 3.1, then how come 5.8 is not a problem? Why should a larger fiscal deficit be a problem? Why? Okay. The idea is that a large fiscal deficit is a problem because it either can generate inflation or it can generate a balance of payments deficit. But hey, it turns out that our fiscal deficit was 5.8% of GDP, not 3.4%, but it hadn't generated inflation or a balance of payments deficit. Had it? We didn't have excessive inflation last year. Our balance of payments deficit was not particularly large. In fact, it was coming down because our imports were falling, because our GDP was not going up. Okay, so why was it not generating more of this? Because the other sectors of the economy were not spending. So why does inflation or an external deficit happen? It happens when total expenditure is greater than your domestic output. But if your total expenditure is not going up, if the government is spending more, but other sectors are not, the households are not, private investors are not, then you don't get inflation or a balance of payments deficit. Do you see my point? So now, so already the economy was weak, and that's why private sector was not spending, households and investors. So that's why even though the government was spending more, it didn't generate those two problems, inflation and external deficit. Now what do we have? Now we have an economy that's not just weak, it's collapsing, it's contracting at a very, very sharp rate. More and more people are getting unemployed, less and less consumption, okay? Now, in fact, a very large fiscal deficit will not create inflation because there's no other demand in the economy. It will not create an external deficit because imports are actually going to fall very massively. In fact, we're probably going to have a current account surplus in this quarter because imports are just falling. There's just, and anyway, the oil price is coming down, which always helps India. But in general, imports are collapsing because we're not producing anything and we're hardly consuming very much, okay? So spending now would not generate either a BOP deficit or more inflation. Now, let's go back to this other point I made. I just want to repeat that once again. The government is cutting down on its spending because it doesn't want to have a large fiscal deficit, because it thinks that large fiscal deficit will give it a high fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. You know, that famous number 3.4 or 4.1. So that, whatever they do, they'll end up with a larger number, and they don't want that larger number. They think that will scare off global investors. But by spending less, they are actually causing the economy to shrink further. So the GDP will fall. Okay. So even though you're spending less, your GDP is falling. So your fiscal deficit to GDP ratio could well rise. Because your GDP is falling, your tax revenues will also fall. So even though you're spending less, your revenues are falling more. And so your absolute volume of fiscal deficit could still rise. Do you understand my point? That, you're spending less, but your tax revenues fall even more. So the deficit part still increases. And meanwhile, your GDP is falling, so that your fiscal deficit to GDP ratio still looks very large. But now it looks large in a declining economy. Whereas if you had spent more, you could have caused GDP to increase, tax revenues would increase, and you wouldn't have a declining economy. Okay. 5 essential points that the people per se can do by themselves irrespective of the government, and 5 points for the government to prioritize. I'm very upset with the first question. Why? Because you've really fallen for this trick of Mr. Modi that you have to be Atmanirbhar. Let's face it, you and I cannot change the course of an economy. All of us together cannot change the course of an economy because we have to be able to spend. Something has to happen for us to have incomes. You cannot tell someone who's lost their job and their home that go out there and spend more. They cannot, right? So this Atmanirbhar nonsense, it's completely missing the point of how an economy functions. If you do not have an income, you cannot then go out and say, I'll be Atmanirbhar, I'll create my own income. You are not Robinson Crusoe. You cannot just create your own income. Even if you choose to go out there and be self-employed, take a cart and put bananas on it and try and sell it. If there's no one to buy your bananas, you still will not get an income, right? So this notion that 5 things that we can do as people and we can create the, we can sort it out. Please don't fall for this, okay? This is a complete abdication of responsibility by the central government, and it's unjustified because this collapse, this economic contraction is not our fault. It's not the people's fault. It's the government's decision which has created it. It has imposed a lockdown that no other country did. It has imposed it without any warning. Again, no other country did that. Most countries gave a week's notice to their citizens, okay? The government has done this. And so we don't have to then turn around and say, now we must be Atmanirbhar. No, we must demand of the government that they have to take the essential measures, because let me remind you, only the government can do it. Only the government can borrow from the central bank and spend. You and I cannot. We cannot go to the central bank and say, give us money, we're going to spend. It doesn't work that way. The government can. The central government must borrow from the central bank to immediately undertake the following expenditures. And now here are the 5 points that the government has to prioritize. The first one it must do is distribute food. At the moment, the government has got at least more than 75 million tons of food grain stocks with the FCI. That was at the end of April. They have stopped giving the figures for more recent days. I don't know why. They normally do it every week. They have stopped giving the figures, possibly because they have even more and it's embarrassing. They need only 21 million tons buffer stock. That's the buffer stock norm. So they have more than 50 million tons extra. Can you imagine? They don't have, now they're collecting rabi harvest. They won't have space to put it. They will actually be putting it in temporary sheds and shelters. The food will be rotting, eaten by rats, okay? Immediately you must distribute this to state governments. Distribute free food, 10 kilograms per person for the next 6 months. 10 kilograms per person for the next 6 months. You can immediately distribute. And do not ask for ration card and this and that. Anybody who wants can go and get it. There will be automatic dropout of about 20% of the population, which does not use this anyway, okay? That's the first step that they must do immediately. It will cost them some money because they're giving it free, but it will also save them money because at the moment, they're actually spending 560 rupees per quintal just storing this damn grain. It costs 560 rupees per quintal per year just to store this grain. So they will be saving that money when they distribute it. Number one. Number two, they must immediately give for 3 months, 7,000 rupees per household, again to 80% of the households, because they caused them to lose incomes. Even those who would have worked for NREGA, there was no NREGA work practically for the whole of April. So you denied them work. It's incumbent on you to give some compensation. So 7,000 rupees per household for 3 months, okay? Both of these together will cost about 3% of GDP, okay? So we have costed it, it will be about 3% of GDP. Then immediately expand the rural employment guarantee. Make it available to every adult. Make it available without any days, work days limit. You know, at the moment it's 100 days per household. Make it 200 days per person, per adult, not per household. And expand the range of activities that NREGA can do. Allow them to work in these tiny and small village enterprises. Allow them to work in enterprises created by the panchayats. Because there's no economic activity now, you've killed off most of it. You have to generate it. You have to allow all of these tiny enterprises to start functioning again. So expand NREGA. Fourth, create an urban employment guarantee, okay? And that also you can do easily. That those two measures together will cost another 2% of GDP, so total 5% of GDP. And then yes, various credit measures and so on, similar to what they have proposed. But those credit measures will only make sense if you are spending yourself, if the government has put money in the hands of those who can spend. And you and I cannot, we cannot be Atmanirbhar in this. The government has got to create that demand. They are the only agency in the country that can do this. Okay. Okay. Then wait a second. What is the next question? Let me just see it here. It seems like sudden and ill-planned lockdown imposed by the central government caused massive migrant labor crisis. Should central government provide universal basic income scheme to migrant labor? Yes, exactly. That's what I said. That you do 7,000 rupees per household for 3 months. I'm saying 3 months because I do believe that eventually you should move to an employment guarantee rather than this. But right now it's lockdown. You cannot work even if you wanted to. So right now is the time for direct cash transfers for the 2 months that have already been lost and for 1 more month, and then follow it up with employment guarantee. How about enhancing the local economy and reverse migration? Isn't this an opportunity for states like UP and Bihar? Yes, absolutely, especially if you can revive the local economy, which is why I'm suggesting that you need to actually expand the NREGA and use it also to provide a wage subsidy to small, medium, and micro enterprises. And so basically, you have to provide the minimum wage, you have to expand it, not substitute existing NREGA works with that, but enable that to provide a wage subsidy to the micro enterprises, because that's the only way the whole economy will revive. And then you can phase it out. Maybe by next year, you don't need it anymore. But right now, you have to do that because that's the only way to get the economy to revive. And if you do that, then you could actually promote rural industrialization and actually generate more Atmanirbhar communities and states and create more diversified economies in those states and enhance agriculture, improve the supply conditions in agriculture and everything. In the current situation, large-scale investors are not interested to invest in manufacturing and service sector. Suppose they're going to invest in agricultural sector, what will be the condition of small-scale farmers, whether it will be enhancing their livelihood or worsen their livelihood? You know, large-scale investors, I would not be a big advocate of encouraging them to invest in agriculture. There are some large investors in specific things, you know, horticulture, for example. There's a lot of contract farming and similar things in specific agricultural activities, or some plantations. But otherwise, large-scale investors are not really interested in agriculture. They're much more interested in contracts that enable them to exploit small-scale cultivators. I don't think that should be the direction that we want to promote. I think we should be interested. Large scale matters where there are economies of scale and where you can really, not just the economies in distribution and so on, but economies of scale in production. So you promote large scale there. Elsewhere, focus on promoting the small and medium enterprises, because that will over time generate much more economic dynamism in which even the large enterprises will thrive. If you remember in China, the town and village enterprises, which were relatively small scale or medium scale, became the basis for both the demand and supply of the large scale production that followed. So that's really the pattern that we're looking at. Okay, that was Gansan's question. Ishika is asking, what is the relation of government expenditure to stagflation? Does it depend on the sector, or if such expenditure is demand supply oriented, etc.? Exactly. So you would get stagflation if the government promoted a lot of demand, but did not ensure that the supply of basic necessities kept pace. So I'm saying that you do government spending, you put money, you encourage demand, you revive demand by putting money in the hands of people, but simultaneously you ensure that the supply of necessities and items of mass consumption is provided, because otherwise that could be inflationary. So what you need to do is to allocate some of your public spending to ensuring that the supply of necessities is maintained. Now that brings back another word that this government hates, which is planning. You can't do this without planning. And by the way, all the countries that are successful across the world have done it by planning. Whether it is managing the pandemic or it is managing the economy, they have been planning. And that goes for everybody from China to Vietnam to Sweden to France to Germany. Everybody has been planning, except us. We don't believe in it anymore, right? So the central government doesn't coordinate with the state governments to plan anything. The different ministries of the central government do not coordinate to plan anything. And as a result, we cannot work together to ensure that the supply of necessities is maintained. At this rate, we could genuinely be in stagflation, because the government will not spend, so the economy will not just stagnate, it will contract, it will collapse. But meanwhile, there will be certain areas where there are supply shortages, and so those prices will go up. So at this stage, we could easily be in the worst of all these worlds. Vamika is asking, the labor migration back to rural areas will further depress the rural condition. How exactly this dynamic will play at a time of adequate government stimulus? Yes, unfortunately. You see, that's why I'm so worried at the inactivity of the government. I'm deeply worried because if you have people going back to the villages, first of all, carrying the virus, bringing back infection in a place where there's really no health infrastructure, where there's no testing, where there's no treatment, where the primary health care is terrible. I'm talking about UP and Bihar. So you have an expansion of the infections, and you have no work, and you have no food. There's a genuine hunger crisis as well, because you're not distributing all that surplus food grain. So yeah, it's a very, very frightening prospect at the moment, which is why I'm saying the demand for more public spending, the demand for immediately distributing the food grain, these are so urgent, these are essential. The alternative is a nightmare beyond what we can imagine. So we have to say that you must do these things and keep making that noise. Okay, Deependra is asking, as government blanketing, oh dear, wait a minute, let me just, why am I not getting this, excuse me. Dipendra, as government blanketing citizens' rights since the beginning of the pandemic, how dangerous is it for a healthy democracy? It is terrifying. It's not just that it is suppressing citizens' rights. I mean, there's really a concern that they actually quite enjoy this lockdown, because it's got rid of all the protests that were mushrooming all over the countryside. They are using this time to get after innocent citizens. Those who were targeted by the violence in Delhi are the ones who are being arrested for the rioting. Innocent students who were helping other people during peaceful protests, they are being accused of riot and murder and all kinds of nonsense and being arrested for that under the most draconian and severe kinds of clauses like UAPA and so on. Anybody can be accused of anything, including people who were patently completely peaceful and not involved, whereas the actual culprits are allowed to roam free. So yes, deeply dangerous for democracy, deeply terrifying, and many people are extremely concerned about this. Okay, I think that was the last question. Yes. Are there any more questions? Or Asika?
Yeah, ma'am. There is, I think, one more question came. 1 second, I will read out to you.
You should tell me. Just read it
So,
out.
yeah, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. The CSR pool has approximately 1 lakh crore pool. In such tough time, when almost all corporate houses ditched their workforce, can it be expected that this money will sow any good? CSR pool fund.
So, here the corporate social responsibility money, yes, which is supposed to be, like 3% of their revenues and so on. So here's the tragedy. A lot of that CSR money is going into PM Cares, that opaque fund that nobody knows what it's used for. And many of the companies that have put quite a lot of money into PM Cares are precisely the same ones that are now shedding their workers. So it's a very misplaced set of priorities. where the government must have arm twisted or persuaded companies to donate this money, but at the same time, they are abandoning their own workers. So I do not have great hopes of the CSR pool. No.
So, ma'am, one more question. So, one second, ma'am. Gautam is asking, what measures should have been done for MSMEs in place that half-baked soft loans announced for MSMEs, ma'am?
Yes, so as I said, basically MSMEs need a package because now they have been smashed. I mean, they were already not fully recovered from demonetization and then that terrible, badly implemented GST. So they were already in bad shape. And I think several lakh of them had actually closed in the previous year. But now they are almost destroyed. So you really have to think of a major package of revival. The first thing has to be demand for their products. If you revive, if you put money in the hands of, say, the rural people through NREGA, through other cash transfers and so on, they will want soap, they will want buckets, they will want this, they will want that, they will want items that can be purchased, produced locally, and they will also want services. So you first of all have to revive demand. For MSMEs cannot survive without a major revival of demand. Second, then you have to, yes, make available credit, but the credit is secondary to the demand. Third, you must actually try and reduce the kinds of other spending costs that they may have. As I mentioned, I talked about a wage subsidy. You can think of various other subsidies that could enable them to survive right now. The moratorium on credit should not mean that you have to pay that interest 6 months down the line. It should mean actually just no payment for the next 3 months. Because if everything can be suspended in an economy, why can't interest payments also be suspended? Workers' wages have been suspended, people's incomes have been suspended, economic activity has been suspended. Why should interest payments carry on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, ma'am. Actually,
Okay.
we got 2 more questions.
All right, I can read these. Yes, I can see these. So
okay.
Deepa is asking, the government has developed an app for contact tracing and tracking. Do you think that that would amount to the development of a surveillance state post-pandemic? Yes, it's a terrifying app. You cannot delete it. Did you know that? And it's been ranked 1 out of 5 in one of these international app checker things because it is very open to, first of all, it doesn't have enough privacy protection. Secondly, it can basically hack into all your other activities on your phone and all other apps on the phone. And thirdly, it actually leaves it open to major fraudulent behavior. So it's a dangerous app, I would say. The point about an app is that it is only successful if it is accompanied by proactive government measures, health measures, right? It's not just enough to say, I'm tracking whoever you're meeting. The government has to do something with that information. If I'm COVID positive and I'm meeting X and Y, the government has to go and test those X and Y. It can't simply say, oh, you have met X and Y. Asika has met somebody else. That's not good enough. The government then, the public health authorities have to go and test the others and say, have you also become COVID positive because you have meeting them? Without that, in other words, just tracking is not good enough. Contact tracing requires testing. Otherwise, it's pointless. At this moment, we're not even testing people who have all the symptoms and are known to be in contact. So what is the point of having an app? It's simply trying to pretend you're doing something and then using that for subsequent monitoring and surveillance. Okay, direct cash transfers in the time of a supply side crunch would give rise to inflation and thus decreasing the value of the money transferred. Yes, but I just told you we don't have to have a supply side crunch. That's precisely the point. So, where have you decided that it's going to necessarily, the supply side crunch right now is because we stopped people from producing. We have to bring people back into producing. We have to label them and allow them to produce. And in the case of items of mass consumption, we have to ensure that they are produced. So not just allow it, but ensure it, enable it and ensure it. And that, as I mentioned, requires planning. So the assumption of the supply side crunch is the wrong one. That's giving in. If you're going to have a supply side crunch, then yeah, sure, anyway you're doomed. Transferring will offer or involve issues of internet banking, flooding of people to banks, etc. No, it need not. That's the whole point. There are many ways of distributing cash. In Odisha, for example, they have a system of distributing pensions openly, directly, weekly at the panchayat in front of everyone. And because it's in the panchayat, everybody knows who is supposed to get it, and everyone can see the amount that is being given. So it's just direct cash transfer by hand. It's not even through a bank account. Many people still do not have bank accounts. There are all kinds of frauds associated with these transfers. The Aadhaar verification is extremely problematic. So what has been suggested is that you do the system of, like you have when you vote in an election, you get the indelible ink put on. You do that kind of a system for the cash transfer. Okay. Uh, could I bring out a legal, Aditya is asking, could I bring out a legal perspective on this new Atmanirbhar package? What is the legal perspective? It's a bit hard to say because, quite honestly, most of it is hot air. Even a lot of those credit guarantees and various other things, a lot of them are not really going to happen. They're not even going to be implemented. A lot of the promises that were made, even of the actual spending in the first package, the package way back in March, even those have not still been implemented. So it's a bit hard to say about the legal implications. I think the legal implications of significance are those that are relating to the new rules for investment, the relaxation of the environmental clauses. That's terrible. That's going to actually, we got over one pandemic only to welcome climate change and to welcome climate disasters. Because if you are opening up and deregulating on the environmental front, reducing the environmental and labor protections, you're asking for an absolute nightmare in terms of both the conditions of workers and the state of the environment. And those legal issues, I think, are of deep concern. I would recommend, or rather request, all young lawyers to actually be looking at what changes in law are implied by those broader statements that were made. Surekha, any measures for states? Yes, absolutely. I should have said this in the very beginning. The schemes that I have outlined all have to be done through the states. That is to say that they must be distributed through the states, implemented by the states, and the money must therefore go to the state governments to implement, just like the NREJ money goes to the state governments. The center doesn't spend enough on it, but when it does, it must go automatically to the state governments. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, the states are massively in deficit, as I've mentioned, and they are the ones doing all the work. Public health spending needs to be expanded to at least 3% of GDP. That means tripling it. At the moment, it's around 1% of GDP. We must triple it, but that money must also go to states. Okay, perhaps along with, on some criteria, but it must go to the state governments. This famous PM CARES, we don't even know how much money has been collected, but people are estimating that it is a lot, okay? At least $10 billion or whatever has been collected. We're not quite sure because, of course, it's non-transparent. But state governments have made a request, and I think it's a perfectly valid request, that this money has been donated to deal with this pandemic. The state governments are the ones dealing with this pandemic. So the money in PM CARES should be distributed to the state governments along on the basis of the Finance Commission formula. That is a just formula that everybody accepts. Some established formula. Take the PM CARES money and distribute it to states. Don't treat it like a private little fund that you will give to favored institutions or items or to buy ventilators from your crony for a hospital in Gujarat. Use it in an open, transparent manner. Distribute it to state governments for specific public health purposes. Okay.
Okay, ma'am. So due to some time constraints, I think we can conclude the section today. So you have explained how the state has been failing to actually address the real issues, how they are failing to actually plan the course of action they should be taking, how they fail the migrants, how they fail us the women, and I think you have taken all the questions intensively and discussed it very well. So we, behalf of Progressive Students Forum, I would like to thank you for taking this session, and hope you are doing well. Take care. Bye.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you. Good luck. Yeah, good luck with everything.